The square was full, but the world beyond it was fuller still, watching. It was a global broadcast, the kind only Rome could summon, beneath stone saints and centuries-old domes. A high feast day. A familiar pope. And a cardinal, quiet, constant, almost forgettable to the secular eye. They expected ritual. They expected scripture. They expected nothing new. Instead, they witnessed a turning. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, not with the weight of ceremony, but with the stillness of decision. His voice, unraised, cut through the murmurs like thunder through fog. He called for Cardinal Tagle. Slowly, Tagle approached, his hands folded, his eyes lowered, as if he already sensed the gravity of what had not yet been said. No one blinked. And then, with the hush of a confessor and the firmness of a judge, Leo spoke, "He shall now guard the soul of nations." No applause followed. No protocol prepared them. The cameras scrambled to adjust. Heads turned. Mouths parted in disbelief. But it was Tagle's response that carved the moment into history. He did not bow. He did not speak. Instead, he removed his ring, kissed the cross carved into its band, and fell to his knees, not before the Pope, but before the crowd. And in that sacred defiance of formality, the entire world was silenced. Because no one had written this ending. No one had choreographed this reverence. And no one, least of all those in power, expected what would come next. So before we enter the room where decisions broke tradition. Before we listen to what was said behind closed doors now torn open. Answer this: what nation do you watch from, and would your soul have stood, knelt, or walked away? The announcement rippled like thunder across continents cloaked in digital static. From Manila to Madrid, Lagos to Los Angeles, headlines screamed the same 7 words, but no one truly understood them. Not yet. Inside the Vatican Apostolic Palace, as the echo of Pope Leo's voice faded, a silence lingered, strangely louder than the crowd. The air itself seemed suspended, held between reverence and suspicion. The feast of Saints Peter and Paul had always carried the scent of incense and legacy. But this year, it bore a different weight, one of disruption. The moment was unprecedented. For over 2 millennia, titles in the Catholic Church had followed a sacred choreography. Bishoprics, prefects, cardinals, successors. But, guardian of the global soul? No one had ever heard it. No archive held it. No conclave had approved it. It emerged from Leo's mouth like a prophetic invention, anointed, untested, irreversible. He stood there, not as a sovereign, but as a survivor. Pope Leo XIV, the old reformer whose election stunned the College of Cardinals years prior. A man forged not in marble halls, but in mud-slick refugee fields. His cassock carried stains not seen, but deeply known, grief, blood, ash. He was the Pope who wept during sermons, who whispered truth where shouting had failed. The same Pope who outlived 5 assassination attempts, not because he was untouchable, but because he was untouching. No scandal ever held him. No nation could claim him. They called him the Father of the Forsaken. But now, they wondered, had age softened him? Had vision outpaced wisdom? For seated just a few feet away was the one the world now scrutinized like a riddle veiled in crimson, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. He sat still as stone, hands clasped, gaze lowered. But make no mistake, his silence did not stem from uncertainty. He had weathered typhoons of politics and persecution with the same calm he now wore. Once mocked for being too gentle, Tagle had buried more martyrs than his critics had read saints. He was the man who sang hymns at the bedside of war orphans, who gave away his coat in the middle of winter and never spoke of it again. And yet now, he stood at the epicenter of a growing global suspicion. Was this elevation truly spiritual? Or was it political theater dressed in vestments? The skeptics wasted no time. Whispers leaked from embassy corridors and newsroom lounges. Is this a coronation in disguise? Is Leo signaling succession? Why Tagle, and why now? Pundits scoured old interviews. Political analysts dug into Tagle's travel logs. Archival footage was replayed frame by frame, searching for secret nods, hidden signals, unspoken pacts. But none could deny the tremble beneath their questioning. Because this wasn't just about the church. It was about the vacuum of moral leadership in a collapsing world. Floods drowned cities. Wars rewrote borders. Children disappeared behind silence. And the church, ancient, slow, aching under its own history, had been accused, more than once, of irrelevance. Now came this title, Guardian of the Global Soul. Not a bishopric. Not a promotion. A calling, divine or delusional, depending on who you asked. Why did this matter? Because somewhere, someone had to speak not just to power, but to conscience. And if Leo was right, if Tagle was truly chosen to do just that, then something tectonic had shifted beneath the foundations of faith and politics alike. But if Leo was wrong? If this was merely sentiment disguised as strategy? Then the world would not wait to tear it down. So as cameras kept rolling and the press scrambled to decode the meaning of a moment heaven itself may have written, the question lingered like smoke in a ruined cathedral: was this the beginning of a sacred movement, or a dangerous mistake? And deeper still, in hearts both faithful and doubting, another question burned: if the soul of the world was truly in danger, would you know what it looked like when someone tried to protect it? If you believe the world still needs guardians not of wealth, not of weapons, but of the soul itself, then stay. Listen. And subscribe to God's message for souls. But if you remain unconvinced, if your heart is still wrestling with doubt, then enter the comments, and tell us why. Why do you believe no one can still be trusted with that kind of truth? They gathered quickly, hungrily, the press. Less than an hour after the appointment was spoken into existence, Vatican officials opened the Sala Stampa for what was meant to be a controlled briefing. But there was no controlling the tide. The world had heard too much to remain quiet, and yet too little to make peace with what they heard. The marble floors echoed with the clatter of shoes and the hum of charging devices. Eyes glinted, not with reverence, but with calculation. These were not pilgrims. These were hunters. Pope Leo XIV appeared not on a screen, but in person, something he rarely did. No podium. No flanked entourage. Just a single chair placed at the center of the room, lit from above like a witness about to testify. He sat. And waited. The first question broke the air like a stone through glass. Your Holiness, a European correspondent began, is this role merely a publicity stunt? The words landed flat, but with intention. Pope Leo did not blink. He folded his hands and answered, quietly, not every call must echo history. The room stiffened. Another voice jumped in, American this time, impatient and sharp. But why invent a title with no precedent? Isn't the Church meant to preserve, not improvise? The Pope looked directly at the man and said, sometimes, heaven plants new names, for old wounds. No laughter. No nods. Only furrowed brows. A third question followed, dripping with implication. Is this a veiled endorsement of Cardinal Tagle's political ambitions? Silence fell like a curtain. The accusation was not dressed as curiosity. It was laid bare. Leo's gaze did not falter. Is healing the soul of a broken world a political ambition? He asked. If so, then perhaps we have misunderstood both politics, and the soul. In the corner of the room stood Tagle, silent still. He neither approached the microphones nor raised his eyes. Instead, he bowed his head and pressed his hands together. His lips moved without sound. A single camera zoomed in. He was praying. And that disturbed them more than any spoken answer could. Journalists thrive on noise, quotable lines, awkward slips, defensive tone. But Tagle gave them none of it. Only stillness. Only surrender. A man freshly crowned with a role the church itself had no words to explain, and yet his first act was prayer. To many, it looked weak. To some, it looked evasive. But to those with discernment, it looked like war in the spirit. Pope Leo watched it all unfold without interference. His voice came again, calm, deliberate. We appoint defenders of borders, of laws, of ideologies, and we call them ministers. He paused, letting the words soak into the marble around him. Why not defenders of the soul? Why not a guardian, for what cannot be governed by law, only by light? No one responded. Pens had stopped scribbling. Lenses had stopped shifting. Something intangible had entered the room. It was not agreement. It was not belief. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty, when met with unwavering peace, is the beginning of transformation. But make no mistake, the fire had only just begun to smolder. The questions would return, sharpened. The pressure would mount. The attack would grow less curious, more personal. Yet in that moment it was not Leo's answers that unsettled the world. It was the fact that he did not try to win them. He simply told the truth. And left them to decide what to do with it. If you have ears to hear, and a heart that still trembles when heaven speaks through unlikely mouths, subscribe now to God's message for souls. But if you resist still, if your mind wrestles and your spirit recoils, enter the comments and name it. What part of your soul is resisting light today? The pause between questions stretched into discomfort. No hand was raised, but a voice rose. Clear, accented, and sharpened by bureaucracy. From the back of the room, where diplomats often stood in shadows, a man stepped forward. His face bore no reverence. His suit was crisp, but his spirit stung with something older than skepticism, contempt masked as curiosity. He did not identify himself, though those who knew the machinery of world affairs recognized him. A secular advisor to the United Nations. A man who had built a career extracting neutrality from chaos. He stepped into the center like a prosecuting voice summoned by silence itself. Your Holiness, he said, let us speak plainly. The temperature shifted. Even the cameras adjusted. Is this appointment, this invention, this guardian of souls, your church's attempt to reclaim political influence? Cloaked in virtue, perhaps. But ambition, nonetheless. The room did not gasp. It held its breath. Pope Leo did not answer immediately. He turned his gaze, not to the man, but to the crucifix that hung above the press arch. For a moment, it seemed he might not respond at all. But then, he stood. And when he spoke, the tone was no longer gentle, it was grave. No, he said. It's an attempt to reclaim spiritual urgency. The words landed with the weight of prophecy. You see governments rise, Leo continued. You see charters signed. Borders enforced. Wars justified. And yet, every year, the world grows darker. Every year, more souls vanish into despair, addiction, hatred, and apathy. He stepped forward, not toward the UN advisor, but toward the center of the room. This isn't about reclaiming power. We've had power. And we repented for it. This is about reclaiming the cry. Someone blinked too loudly. A chair shifted. But no one interrupted. I have watched Cardinal Tagle kneel beside men whose faces had been melted by chemical bombs, Leo said. He did not preach. He did not record. He fed them. He held them. He wept beside them. Not as a bishop, but as a man. His voice dropped lower. In Aleppo, I watched him trade his boots for a child's blanket. He walked barefoot through rubble, and the child, who had lost both parents that morning, fell asleep in his arms. He closed his eyes for a moment. There are no politics in that kind of pain. There is only the gospel. A few journalists lowered their phones. Some didn't notice their own tears. Pope Leo lifted his hand. Not to silence them, but to gather their attention like a shepherd might gather scattered sheep. Politics divides. The gospel unites. Nations debate. But the soul only weeps or rejoices. He turned slowly, his voice now the sound of holy fire. This role was not born in the marble halls of the Vatican. It was born in the screams of trafficked children. In the final breaths of forgotten war victims. In the hollow stares of youth who've never been touched by love. This title was not conceived in Rome, but in the cries of a hurting world. No one moved. The advisor, so bold just minutes before, lowered his gaze, as if forced to stare into something older than time. And then, from the back, a sound no one expected, a whispered prayer. Not from clergy. But from one of the press. Leo heard it. He did not smile. He did not claim it. He simply returned to his chair, and sat. Because nothing more needed to be said, for now. If your heart still feels the cry of this broken world. If your soul is not numb to the sacred weight of suffering. The stillness that followed Pope Leo's final words had weight to it, a sacred heaviness, like incense hanging thick in the rafters after the choir has gone quiet. For a moment, even the doubters seemed to listen with more than their ears. But the silence did not last. It never does. A journalist seated near the front, young, eager, and razor-sharp with ambition, leaned into her microphone. Her voice was clear, but it carried a tone polished for headlines, not reverence. So, Your Holiness, she began with calculated levity, is Cardinal Tagle your successor? The question pierced through the tension like an arrow through glass, deliberately provocative, wrapped in a smile. The room stirred. She wasn't alone. From the opposite aisle, another voice joined. Deeper, older, and sharper with cynicism. Or is he simply your puppet? The jab landed not in jest but in judgment. Two questions, fired like twin shots, one cloaked in curiosity, the other in contempt. A perfect trap. All eyes turned toward Leo. Would he deny it? Laugh it off? Deflect with doctrine or delay with diplomacy? He did neither. Pope Leo XIV remained seated, his back straight, his hands relaxed in his lap. The weight of power did not rest on his shoulders, but the weight of truth did. And he bore it like a man familiar with thorns. He looked at the two questioners. Not through them. Not above them. At them. And then he said, softly, but with the full force of eternity behind it, I've held dying children in my arms, and I never asked their religion. The room didn't move. He continued. I have walked through bombed-out clinics and stepped over blood-stained pages of schoolbooks. I have cradled infants who would not live till morning and washed the feet of mothers who had forgotten what hope felt like. His eyes did not harden. They deepened. You call it naive to protect the innocent? He asked, with no anger, only ache. I call it sacred. And with that, the spell of cynicism broke. But the story was not finished. Without warning, Cardinal Tagle rose. It was the first time since the announcement that he stood to speak. No script in his hands. No briefing in his pocket. Only a stillness that had been mistaken for submission, now revealing itself as the patience of a storm that knew exactly when to break. He walked forward, not to the podium, but beside Pope Leo. He faced the room. And then, for the first time, he spoke. I did not ask for this title, he said, voice calm but edged with something holy. I did not seek it, prepare for it, or desire it. He looked toward the press. But his eyes did not accuse. They invited. But I will carry it. Like a cross. There was no tremble in his voice. No hesitation in his breath. He spoke like a man who had already buried his ambition and now stood only to serve. If it breaks me, he continued, then let it break me in service. Let it break the part of me that fears. Let it crush the part of me that still clings to comfort. He turned slightly toward the Pope, his elder, his brother in spirit. And if it remakes me, let it remake me into what the world most needs, not a prince of power, but a servant of souls. No applause followed. There was no room for such things. Only silence. The kind that recognizes when heaven has spoken. And in that silence, something shifted, not in the press room, but in the hearts of those who had gathered to tear down, yet now stood face to face with something they had long forgotten how to name. Conviction. If you have ever been broken and rebuilt, if you've ever carried something too heavy and yet refused to drop it, then you understand what was spoken in that room. Subscribe now to God's message for souls, not to witness events, but to discern the movements beneath them. And if you still resist, if something inside you cannot receive what you've heard today, enter the comments and ask yourself, what part of you still mocks what others are willing to die for? There was a long pause after Tagle's final word. The kind of pause that didn't ask for applause, but reverence. His words had drawn the room into a solemn hush, not by volume, but by vision. And as he stepped back, not to retreat but to surrender, the silence held. Pregnant, fragile, trembling with something sacred. Pope Leo remained seated, but his presence filled the room as if he'd risen again. He looked over the crowd not as a performer surveying an audience, but as a shepherd reading the faces of sheep who had wandered too far into the wilderness of their own logic. And then his voice returned, not louder, but lower. Not colder, but deeper. It was the voice of a man who no longer wished to persuade, only to proclaim. You confuse engagement with endorsement. His eyes swept across the press, the advisors, the silent watchers from behind their lenses. You think that to walk among the broken is to agree with their sin. That to speak with sinners is to betray the saints. That to protect the abused is to compromise the powerful. He leaned forward ever so slightly. But the gospel was never afraid of proximity. The room stiffened. You believe that defending dignity is the same as defending doctrine, he said slowly, as if tasting the weight of each syllable. But the man on the cross did not ask for a theological test. He said, "Today, you will be with me in paradise." That was not doctrine. That was mercy. The words landed like slow thunder, measured, undeniable. You think the church must hide to stay holy, he continued. But light doesn't hide. It shines. Even when it offends the eyes of those who've been in darkness too long. The audience began to shift. A few lowered their phones. Some finally stopped scribbling. There were murmurs now, uncontrolled, involuntary. People looked at each other not in doubt, but in discomfort. Because truth, when it is unafraid, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be unflinching. And then Leo's tone turned sharp, not angry, but piercing. Why, he asked, does defending the vulnerable make you uncomfortable? No one answered. Why, he pressed further, does Tagle's humility threaten you? Silence again, but not the same as before. This silence was exposed, cornered, caught in the mirror of its own pride. Is it because he does not play your game? Leo asked. Because he kneels instead of shouts? Because he carries the weight of the world's sorrow, and does not seek to make a brand out of it? He let that question sit. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as if the machines themselves sensed something eternal was pressing through the veil. He has no ambition for crowns, Leo said, quieter now. But he will bleed for the soul of the world. And if that frightens you, perhaps it is not his calling that needs examining, but yours. A quiet gasp escaped from someone in the second row. Another reached for their crucifix instinctively, like one does when thunder shakes the windows. And Pope Leo, having said what needed to be said, returned to stillness. His eyes closed. His hands rested once again. He had not crushed them. He had not condemned them. He had only offered truth, unsoftened, undiluted, unmoved by applause or disapproval. And the truth dismantled them. If something within you stirred as you heard those words, if a trembling reached the part of your soul that has long been silenced, subscribe now to God's message for souls. Not to be entertained, but to be reawakened. But if you still resist, if you still squirm at the sight of humility with authority, of service with power, enter the comments and wrestle with this. What are you afraid will happen, if light shines where you've grown comfortable in the dark? The weight of the room had reached its peak, pressed flat beneath the slow, measured collapse of pride. But Pope Leo, even after dismantling the illusions with truth, did not leave them there. He was not a destroyer. He was a gardener. And now that the field had been cleared of thorns, he would plant something deeper, something enduring. His voice, when it returned, was no longer edged with fire. It flowed like oil poured gently over bruises. This, he said, isn't about the Church's power. It's about her presence. He stood now, not in defense, but in invitation. We have built too many walls of protocol and too few bridges of presence. We have crowned too many names with gold and clothed too few wounds with compassion. He looked out over the crowd, not as a pope surveying loyalists or critics, but as a father searching the faces of estranged children. We need fewer titles of status, he said. And more titles of service. There was no thunder in his voice now. Only gravity. Only grace. He turned slightly, gesturing for Cardinal Tagle to step forward once more. And Tagle did, quietly, unceremoniously, like a man who had learned long ago that holiness wears no perfume. He looked across the sea of faces, many of whom still avoided his gaze, not out of defiance, but guilt. Let the world remember this, Tagle said, with the stillness of a man who had prayed the words long before speaking them aloud. A soul defended, is a nation healed. No one moved. If my hands tremble under this task, he continued, may they tremble in prayer. Not because I fear what I face, but because I revere the weight of every soul I've been asked to carry. He looked not at the Pope now, nor the press, but beyond them, as if seeing something they could not yet see. As if already walking among the ruins of the places he was being sent to serve. Then he bowed, not for show, but from conviction, and stepped back into silence. Pope Leo lifted his eyes once more, and spoke one final time, not as an authority, but as a witness to something higher than even his own office. We don't need more men in robes, he said. His voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with the weariness of truth. We need more witnesses in love. The room didn't applaud. It repented, quietly, internally, without ceremony. Not all hearts changed. Not all minds were moved. But all of them, heard. And that was enough. If you, too, believe the world is not dying from lack of religion, but from lack of love. If you believe presence is more powerful than position, then subscribe now to God's message for souls. Let this space become sanctuary, not spectacle. But if you're still watching from the edge, guarded, unsure, unwilling, enter the comments. And ask yourself, have you confused holiness with hierarchy, and forgotten the sound of real love when it speaks without raising its voice? What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would your voice have joined the questions, sharp, probing, eager to unmask? Would you have whispered doubts beneath your breath, cloaked as cleverness, shielding your heart from conviction? Or would you have felt it? What the cameras couldn't capture, the trembling undercurrent of something ancient waking up. Would you have clapped with the crowd, or knelt beside the burden? When truth no longer needed to shout, when holiness stood without defense, when service was elevated above stature, what would you have done? Would you have reached for applause, or anointing? These are not questions for journalists, nor cardinals, nor diplomats. They are questions for anyone who has ever sat in a room filled with power, and forgotten the weight of compassion. They are questions for the skeptic, and the seeker. For the broken, and the brave. Because moments like these are not remembered by how loud the room was. They are remembered by who walked away changed. So may you, wherever you sit right now, behind whatever screen, carrying whatever questions, seek truth with a humble heart. And may your soul not leave God's message for souls unchanged. Subscribe, not for stories, but for sacred awakenings. Let this space be where your silence turns to purpose. Where your questions become prayer. Where your cynicism finally surrenders to wonder. Still won't? Then enter the comments. And be honest, what truth here stirred your spirit, or scared your soul?